All right. Welcome, gentlemen. This is going to be a great program. A lot of interesting things to discuss about. And let's do this one at a time here so we give our audience a chance to hear the difference between both of you, your voices, and so forth. So let's say hi and welcome to the author of this book that we're going to discuss today here. Kent Bain, welcome, and thank you for talking with us today, Kent.
Thank you. Good to be with you, Henrik.
Excellent. And we also have the publisher from Trine Day with us, Chris Milligan. Welcome, Chris. Many thanks for being with us here today as well.
My pleasure, sir. Thank you very much.
Absolutely. And you're the author of Fleshing Out the Skull and Bones, Investigations into America's Most Powerful Secret Society. Excellent book on the subject matter. And obviously in the last few years now, you've been busy with the publishing of many excellent books at Trine Day. So tell us just a little bit about your publishing history, Chris. I mean, you have some great titles out there. One of my favorites, Peter Levenda's Sinister Forces, but there's just so many more excellent books you have in the lineup, Chris.
Well, I'm totally amazed. I mean, basically, I'm a musician, and just happened that my father had worked for the intelligence services, and he had quit them in the late 50s, and he started talking to me in the late 60s, and I didn't understand him. But because of that, I hung out in a land that officially doesn't exist, CIA drugs. And I ran across a gentleman who was having trouble getting his book published. And so I became aware of, and then I was trying to write about Skull and Bones, and nobody would print my stuff. And so I became aware that there was a lot of titles out there, such as Peter Levenda's, which had been kicking around New York for years, and nobody would publish them. And I'm a simple guy. I read the Constitution, and it doesn't seem to me that books should not be published. And so I took it upon myself to publish these suppressed works and bring them to the public, because books are a special thing. They're an act of creation. And they help us to understand ourselves and the world around us. So I'm happy to do it. It's a struggle, but I think good things are going to happen. So very kindly for your nice words, but that's why I do it.
Thank you. Excellent. We'll give you an opportunity, obviously, to mention some of your titles a little bit later and websites and everything else. But Kent, let's shift our focus to you a little bit. I've read that you have a very interesting and significant background to all of this, to the subject we'll be discussing today, both considering your interest, but also that you, or where you used to work, and shall we say, where we can call it proximity to some of the conspirators, some of the suspects here. Tell us about your background a little bit. What led you up to writing this book, coming out now about 11 years after the event?
Right. I was a bit of a latecomer to the 9/11, the search for 9/11 truth. Actually, when I worked at the Weekly Standard from 1995 to 2001, I really wasn't awake at that point. Really wasn't familiar with conspiracy theories, and so as I began to look into 9/11, there were a lot of things that caught my attention that I wanted to further investigate. It was certainly a process that I went through as far as becoming familiar with the existing conspiracy theories and then trying to make sense of them. So my understanding of 9/11 has evolved over a considerable period of time.
Indeed, and tell us a little bit where you worked and some of your close associates. Well, not associates then, but they worked in offices close to yours, correct?
That's right. I worked with William Crystal and Fred Barnes, Tucker Carlson, and David Brooks for about 5.5 years. And our offices, the magazine offices, were co-located basically with the Project for the New American Century, which was a neoconservative think tank that Bill Crystal had started that had a lot of signatories that had signed on to the organization and supported its position papers and that type of thing. It was interesting to be mixing with those individuals and to be in such close proximity to that organization. We were located in the same building with the American Enterprise Institute, and our office building was about 3 or 4 blocks from the White House, and ABC News was just directly around the corner. So it was an exciting experience for me. It was certainly a jump for me. I had previously been the art director for the Oxford American magazine, which at the time was based in Oxford, Mississippi, and published by author John Grisham. And so it was a bit of a culture shock when I landed the job and moved to Washington. But I just thoroughly enjoyed the time there, and it was a real learning opportunity for me, and I was exposed to a lot of different ideas and a lot of different schools of thought.
Yeah, definitely. I can imagine. Now, tell us a little bit about why what happened and how you began to look at 9/11 with different eyes, basically as a mass ritual, as the subtitle to the book goes. Kent.
Right. I guess it was probably around 2006 when I really began to become interested in the September 11th as more than just a terrorist attack. And as many of your listeners will understand or will know, there are multiple levels to 9/11, from the practical objectives that the orchestrators of the event had, to various other objectives, and as I kind of worked my way through the levels and began peeling the onion, I began to discover things that were just entirely new to me. So I had to do a lot of background research so that I was able to better understand what I was finding and encountering. And slowly I began to realize that there was a much bigger story there than had been told previously. And I had to do background and research in quite a number of fields in order to really understand what I was faced with and to understand what I was finding. And much of it, of course, was disturbing in nature and took a while for me to process and kind of to come to terms with. But it the shift in thinking required to understand 9/11 as more than a terrorist attack and even more than a false flag terrorism attack is pretty significant. And as I looked at the various elements and a lot of things that didn't make sense, and began to notice some common themes and some common ideas, I realized that there was a framework that could be used to understand all of these things that were confusing and really didn't seem to tie together. And that framework was psychological warfare. And in many instances, you will find occult aspects incorporated into psychological warfare. And as I became more and more familiar with the different topics and with the different aspects of 9/11, I realized that that's what I was looking at was a very large-scale application of occult-oriented psychological warfare programming.
There is a few different components here we need to get into and kind of lay the background, obviously, because we want to talk a little bit more about your findings and your conclusions, and you put up in the book as a kind of the production overall and the producers, and we'll get into some of this. But I think one of the more important parts to go through here or look at in more detail before we kind of get into the meat of it, if you will, is to look at the symbolism, symbol literacy. I know you have a chapter on this, and this is highly important. Let's say we're talking to somebody who is a complete novice on these subject matters. Kent, how would you lay this up and to describe the symbolism behind the events?
Well, considering it at one point that I was very much a novice, I had to do a considerable amount of research to understand symbols and their meanings and their importance within occult doctrine. and then how they're utilized as parts of occult rituals, occult architecture, and just basic occult practices. And it is certainly a mindset that is foreign to the average person, and so it's part of the way that things occult rituals are carried out in plain sight. Because if we're unfamiliar with the symbols, unfamiliar with their meanings, then we can be looking at a massive occult symbol and have no idea of that fact, and then not realize then that there's something larger than going on than, say, the destruction of two very large skyscrapers, or an attack on the nation's Department of Defense. So the understanding the symbols involved with 9/11 is key, and it people are in general skeptical when you start talking about the massive symbols being involved as part of some 9/11 mega ritual. But it's very important to understand how significant that these symbols are within occult thought, and that was one of my challenges. And then it was one of the challenges in writing the book, is laying that out effectively without going on forever about the importance of a particular symbol, establish that it was is indeed important, very significant, and then build on that to say, oh, here's what it means in terms of what was done on 9/11 itself. And as you referenced, I do treat the day of 9/11, the various events, and locations. I treat those as part of a script, and sort of describe it in terms of a script, and the different acts, and an ongoing production that day, and then try to highlight the symbols and their significance in light of the individual acts or components of an overall script for 9/11.
And there is a couple of different components to this. We have the towers themselves. We have some interesting actions consequently during when all this is happening, that goes into the story of the pet goat, basically, and then we can move it on to the Pentagon. But maybe we should run through these a little bit more in some detail, Kent, and kind of give us your perspective on this and the script that you mentioned, and the important components in the script.
Right. Well, the Twin Towers represented the Pillars of Hermes, and also could be seen to represent the two pillars of Freemasonry. The Pentagon has a range of occult meanings and significance to various occult schools of thought, but it's certainly more than just the fact that they were supersize occult symbols. The meanings, the esoteric connections that these symbols have are very much a part of the occult doctrine that was at the heart of the occult 9/11 occult mega ritual. It's not just that they were built to be large occult symbols. That is just the sort of the superficial aspect of it. It's what they represent, what the symbols represent, what the meanings are, and in various instances, it this is part of their invocation of various deities, and it's difficult to describe all of this in a short span of time, and that's it was one of the difficulties writing the book, is that there's so much interweaving and overlaying of the elements and of dates of the various things that were done to either pay homage to or to invoke various deities. The primarily, as one finds as you read through the book, it's a Luciferian mega ritual, but that's certainly by no means just a large scale or global scale satanic ritual, even although you could characterize it on some level as such. But it was much more sophisticated, much more textured and nuanced than just a stereotypical mass satanic ritual broadcast on the global airwaves. And so it's a bit of a challenge to describe to your listeners exactly the roles that the symbols played without connecting the dots to the importance of the date itself, to various other symbols and iconic pieces of architecture that had occult meanings and occult significance that were present at Ground Zero and around Ground Zero, because as we deal with later on in the book, it's not a matter of just simply, okay, the Twin Towers were represented the pillars of Hermes, or that the Building 7 was almost humorously referred to as the Solomon Brothers building, and
right, yeah.
It's that you can begin to see Ground Zero as a massive occult or a massive ritual ceremonial center, because there are buildings that surrounded the Twin Towers that have very significant and potent occult symbols on the rooftops, the buildings of the World Financial Center, and then the Statue of Liberty, of course, can be seen to be part of that overall area or ritual center, if you will. And the one thing that I found in looking at all of the information, it just began to be very evident that there was just the occult script, if you will, was just dripping with dark humor. Even though people were being sacrificed, people were dying, there were buildings being blown up.
Sure.
A lot of what you find is just laden with mockery of the general public, mockery of the victims, and it's just again dripping with dark humor. And so that was one reason I wrote about the occult script and used a good deal of humor in trying to describe it, because I'm not sure that you could write in a serious fashion about something that is on one disturbing level. It's a big joke, and of course the joke is on us, but sure. I tried to maintain a balance between communicating information that was key for the readers to understand the occult principles behind this occult ritual, but then also, lightening it up a bit and kind of giving them insight into the mindset of the orchestrators of this event, and so that they could see that they were in fact having apparently a good deal of fun at our expense and just mocking us outright in a number of instances. And there are various instances throughout the book where I point that out, that there's no compelling explanation for some of the things, either various names or symbols that were involved, other than just outright mockery. And I've shifted subjects on you a little bit there, but the understanding the role that symbols play, that has to take place in context of quite a number of other things in order for you to fully understand the role that they played in the overall 9/11 mega ritual. Exactly,
it's indeed, and it's, as you said to me before, Kent, it's one symbol, one item, one date, one name in itself. It means something. It's strong, but it's when you put and piece all of these things together that you kind of begin to realize that something else must be going on here. And one thing I've continually asked people we talked to about this nature of 9/11 and the occult symbolism behind it and everything is how planned this is and how thought out this occult ritual is. If there's components within here that actually might be coincidences, I don't think so, not too much anyway. But it seems like New York is the perfect stage for this, if you know what I mean. We have to go back a long time in history to realize that, all right, maybe not everything was built for this event, perhaps, but maybe it was. So I don't know, how far do you go in that, Kent, in terms of how long this has been in the works and how long it's been planned, or did they piece together and said, well, this is a perfect playground to use it, let's strike this, and that, because it fits into the overall picture of what we want to try to do. What's your take on that, Kent?
Well, it is difficult to know where to draw the line between what was constructed for the purposes of what is, by all evidence, a grand mega ritual involving multiple buildings that constitute or represent very substantial or important occult symbols. Which of these buildings were constructed for the purpose of the mega ritual, and which of them perhaps were there and just incorporated into the mega ritual? I don't necessarily seek to answer that question in the book. I do discuss it some, but you by the time you get to the end of the discussion on 9/11 as an occult ritual, you're able to really draw some pretty solid conclusions about that, because I also do. There is a chapter on the timeline and perhaps how long the planning for 9/11, how far it went back, and that type of thing.
Yep.
But I came to some rather I guess solid conclusions, and I hope the reader will as well, about the extent of the pre-planning that would have taken place in order to facilitate a mega ritual of this scale. And you do end up really wondering, okay, were in fact many of these buildings not constructed to play the roles that they played on 9/11? And they're not just we're not just talking about one or two buildings. We're talking about again a whole collection of buildings that each represent something very important in occult thought and played a very specific role and represented something very specific in the 9/11 ritual itself. And to think that somehow they were clustered together just by chance, and then that was taken advantage of by the planners of 9/11, it's kind of hard to make that to ascribe it to coincidence, or to just think, well, that was a lucky happenstance on their part that all of that was there for them to take advantage of. When you get down and you've read through all of the different chapters on the different components of 9/11 and the all of the effort that was put into creating this occult monstrosity, this just grand macabre production, that you end up with some really sort of disturbing conclusions, which are that many of these buildings would have had to have been constructed well in advance for their use on 9/11. Now, not perhaps all of them, but when you again, context is key, because if someone were to have just come in, say, 5 minutes ago, and they were listening to this part of this discussion, they'd think this guy's lost his marbles. But when you I kind of, what I tried to do in writing the book was start people off with the very basic discussion on symbols and what they meant to, or what they appeared, the meaning that they appeared to have to the orchestrators of the occult mega ritual, and then slowly move forward and build, and then say the Twin Towers were apparently symbolized this, and the Pentagon symbolized this, and then move forward and kind of expand the scope of the discussion and the the geographic focus. And so you move beyond the Twin Towers to the World Financial Center, to the Millennium Hotel, to the Statue of Liberty, and then you begin to piece all of these things together. And you again, the concept of a modern day mass scale ritual center, ritual complex really is a very powerful one, because it's hard to account for everything, all of these different pieces of the puzzle if you don't have that larger context to place them in.
Right. And
because you cannot have, it would be just statistically impossible to have all of these different things sort of floating around and they just kind of pick and pull, and to have a clustering of important, massively important symbols all in one location that just kind of all happen to come into play on one day at one time. I mean, you and I know that the universe doesn't work that way, and so if it's not coincidence, then what is it? And then the answers to that question are, genuinely disturbing, because you're looking at something, an event being manipulated on a scale that most people would be very uncomfortable with, and what that implies as far as the power that these individuals would have, their ability to manipulate our environment, our reality, the length of time that it would have taken them to do that, to have conceived of this plan and put the pieces of the mega ritual in place, perhaps over a period of decades. The questions that arise out of the discussion in the book are almost as disturbing as what is in the book itself. And I don't seek to answer the question of who did this with any specificity. I'll talk about some logical suspects and talk about some different organizations and individuals without going into a lot of detail, but you're left with a very unsettling feeling that the world doesn't operate like you thought it did, and there are some extremely influential interests that are toying with our reality and mocking us to our faces, and it just I've had a couple of years to get used to all of this, and I'm still not comfortable with the implications of kind of the conclusions that come out of piecing together the evidence in this book.
Sure.
And so,
can you ever?
I would certainly understand, readers being skeptical, or they're just having a visceral reaction to it of, okay, this can't be true. He may not be right, but I don't have an explanation, but that's fine. I don't want to believe what he's saying. I could understand that reaction to this, but taking, that's why it's difficult for me to describe it to a degree that's a convincing degree in a relatively short period of time. Why I'm convinced that this was a genuine global ritual, because
Sure.
it was so well thought out, so thoroughly planned out, that we're left kind of just holding our head in our hands and just kind of looking off into the distance.
Well, you do a great job in the book of kind of laying this out, and we'll pick out some of these nuggets in a little bit here as well. There's much more to get into. I want to ask you a little bit about the producers of the event, as you call it in the book, and also then later on we're going to get into the prediction, if you will, for the potential next 9/11 as suggested in the book. But before we go there, Chris, when you've going through some of this material and reading what Kent has pulled together, what's your general feeling and thought about this? And are you on the same page? It's just a very unsettling scenario that it's painted here, Chris?
Well, like I said earlier, I started hanging out in a land called CIA drugs, and that's basically, the importation of narcotics. The other side, then there's another side of CIA drugs I call the dark side, okay, which, includes their experiments into LSD and other chemicals and just psychological warfare. Okay, and so I've done a lot of study into mind control and to psychological warfare, so I was familiar with a lot of the things that Kent was talking about. I really enjoyed some of the stuff that he brought to the table in that his always talking about how conspiracy theory and there's all these different conspiracy theories and maybe one of the reasons that there's all these different conspiracy theories along the way is to confuse us and whatnot. And so and then I've always looked at the Kennedy assassination at the end of the day as being a ritual, the ritual of killing of the king.
Yeah.
And so it was territory that I was familiar with, and I thought that he had, put something together that was very significant, and Kent didn't know if he could write it, and he'd written me some things, and I said, Kent, I think you can write it, and you're the person to write it because, you're really the person that put it all together. And the other thing, the significance of having this, if you want to say a cult temple of buildings, was very, very eye-opening. And when a person really looks at, what he has to say in the totality, I find it quite convincing, and I sent it to other people such as Lavinda and whatnot, and they again found it substantial, and so we put it out.
Yeah, definitely. It's very interesting, and there's so many components to this, and we'll carry on a little bit here more about this, Kent, and bring some of these components together and kind of present it to our audience, to our listeners here as well. The towers, obviously, as you talked about, is significant in this sense, either from the point of view of Hermes pillars or Jachin and Boaz of Freemasonry as being struck or taken down in that sense. And you do go into Crowley a bit as well in the book. How important is it to understand Aleister Crowley and all this?
Well, it seems to have been it is extremely important because it seems to have been highly important to the orchestrators of the 9/11 ritual. I write in the book that on some level the occult ritual could be seen almost as an ode to Aleister Crowley, because there are so many references, whether in terms of the symbols that were important to him or the numbers. His number was the number 11. He claimed that number as being his own in various writings, and of course the number 11 was woven into the 9/11 in multiple ways that I detail in the book. But the Crowley was is considered by some as the godfather of modern Satanism, and he's just an occultist of the highest order. And on one level, he is the key to kind of understanding or deciphering the occult mega ritual, because there are references to either the Crowley name or to some of the secret societies, well, not secret societies, but cult organizations that he founded that are just scattered throughout 9/11 itself. And again, these are, if people don't really know what I'm talking about at this point, it's because a lot of these things are hidden, sometimes in plain sight, sometimes less so, but they are there nonetheless. But he was, I guess, in a way, the unseen star of 9/11, and so he's very important to being able to piece together what was done that day. They did key a number of the different components of the mega ritual to numbers that were significant to him, and so you're able to draw on Crowley's own writings and established occult thought on Crowley to have key insights into the different components of the mega ritual.
In the foreword written by Peter Levenda, he talks also about the importance of Kabbalism and being a Kabbalist because of the looking at the numerology and the significance of what the numbers represents and everything else. Is this something you had to go into as you were discovering the numbers, or wanted to try to understand the numbers, or did you have like peripheral knowledge about this from before, Kent?
That was I had to research that extensively, and there were a number of different sources that I was able to find that helped me, I guess, get a better grasp on what I was looking at, what I was uncovering, and then being able to put it in context. There are a couple of books in particular that I acknowledge in my introduction to the book, but it was. I kind of view the book, the final product, as a collaboration between dozens, if not hundreds, of people that I never met. Actually,
sure,
not a true collaboration, but I drew from so many different sources. Had to read, from various textbooks on the occult to different blog sites and websites and conspiracy bulletin boards. I had to engage in kind of a dragnet operation to pull in all the various data points that then took me some time to sort of pull together. And now some people had done some of the work already and made some of the connections, but then not taken it quite to the extent that I took it, because it is such a massive thing. It's hard to know when you found the bottom of it, or when you've gotten a hold of the whole thing. And so researchers that whose work I looked at and drew from and built on, they may have thought that they had found maybe the extent of the occult aspect, and when really they had just gotten started. And the
rabbit hole goes deep, as they say, right? So it's when you begin to go down it and descend it, it's like it's a bottomless abyss at some stage. And the question is, how much could be found? When you put together the book, Kent, do you feel that I could sit here and compile and bring in more and more names and dates and numbers into this and continue it even further than you've done?
I'm not sure. I'm based on everything that I uncovered during the research and writing process. I would have to think that there are things that I missed that are not included. I wouldn't know how much further how many more details, how many more occult references could be sandwiched into what is already this occult monstrosity that's just got things popping out all over the place. I'm sure there are maybe occult principles, elements, symbols that I missed. But at some point I just had to make the determination that, okay, this is enough. This is as much as I want to deal with, and it's probably as much as the reader cares to digest at one sitting anyway. So there may be someone who can come along and add additional insight to what I've done, and certainly I've built on the work of others as well. But once I sort of, I guess, picked up on the language that was utilized, and then got the idea and had the understanding that it was not all done, even though people were being sacrificed and buildings were burning, that it was not, a super serious endeavor. I mean, that there was just a really biting humor that was behind a lot of this, and I got a feel for sort of the approach that they had utilized in a couple of the instances, as that allowed me, understanding that language allowed me to kind of cast about and look for other examples, and to go back and maybe look at some things that didn't seem to be very suspicious or important on first glance, but take another look at them and say, okay, well, what might this mean if given their propensity towards mockery and the incorporation of morbid humor, what might this name mean, or what might this location be tied to, or what and that type of thing. So it once I began to I guess once I learned that language to a certain extent, and then began to look in depthly at the various incidents that were part of 9/11, things just began to just bubble out and just emerge. And at some point I sort of wished it would stop, because everywhere I turned and thought, okay, if I'm correct, there should be something here. Well, I'd turn that rock over and there'd be something there. And I'd just think, well, when is this going to stop? Because this is getting uglier and uglier by the minute, and more disturbing. And it kept going. That process kept going for some time. And then at some point I felt like I had not necessarily gotten to the bottom of it, but as deep as I was prepared to go. And had as much as I could probably explain effectively in one book, and it was probably as much as anyone would want to read on the topic at one time. So that's kind of how that unfolded.
So let's talk a little bit more. We're going to get into, we can bring up some clear examples here in a little bit, but what the language is this ritual magic, and it's an evil magic, as you write in the book. And the question is, what is being communicated, Kent? What are those who are behind the planning of this trying to say to us, do you think?
Well, various, I refer to them as acts, and the acts in the production or the play. Various acts had various meanings, and the some of which I think I understand to a certain degree, and then I'm sure some of it went right past me and right over my head, and I didn't, probably didn't capture it all. But the different components would have their own sort of self-contained meanings that then were incorporated into the broader script, and so there were the individual little production, mini productions that were part of this grand production. And that, toward the end of the book, I reconstruct the occult script for the entire ritual, and kind of go through it, do an overview, and pull it together rather in as concise a fashion as I could, and it as far as one central meaning that they would be trying to communicate to us, I don't know that there is one. There were all sorts of things that they were referencing for their own benefit, and deities, primarily Lucifer, that they were invoking on multiple levels and multiple instances throughout the script, and little hints of mockery that they were dropping right and left throughout the day's events. So there was not really, a central. Well, there was a central theme, and if they were communicating a central message, it would have been one of honoring or paying homage to Lucifer on one level. Now, this is something that requires a little bit of further discussion, because as I go into in the book, toward the end, even though you work through all of this, and you see what are clearly references to Luciferian doctrine and acts of worship to Lucifer, you get the sense in a number of instances that these are perhaps not just occultists, but hardcore Luciferians. You also begin to pick up on hints that you perhaps are not dealing with a group that is made up entirely of true believers, if you will. That perhaps the they don't take the Luciferian worship or the Luciferian components as seriously as we would believe at first when we start looking at this and digging into it, and we start looking at all of the different occult and Luciferian symbols that were woven into it. There are hints that also that this is just part of the mass scale psychological warfare programming that is designed to traumatize us and to torment us. And if you think about the mass mind, the global public as being a unified psyche, then if you're familiar with mind control and psychological warfare and the different techniques used to manipulate the human mind, if you think about 9/11 as a technologically driven tool for manipulating the mass mind and the global public, global consciousness, it takes on an even darker character, because as you're probably familiar, the most effective mind control techniques involve the occult, whether or not the practitioners, the people involved with the ritual or the ceremony, whether or not they truly believe in Satan, Lucifer, whatever their type of ceremony they're conducting. It's the effect on the individual that's important, the traumatic effect of the blood and the men in the dark robes and so forth, that just creates the maximum traumatic impact on the victim. And so in that way, if we look at the occult aspect of 9/11 as integral to the psych warfare mind control objectives of the event itself, and what they could well have been seeking to do to their the global audience, then that begins to that provides I think a good framework for understanding a lot of what was done. And so it's not as simple as saying, yes, 9/11 was a global Luciferian mega ritual. It's as disturbing as that might be, it's when you begin to understand it as part of an extremely well thought out, sophisticated psychological warfare program targeting not just Americans but the global public, and that's was extremely effective and has been used for 10 plus years and continues to be used to this very day to keep us in perpetual fear. That's an entirely different thing, and it's you sort of go from bad to worse, from it looking like a nasty occult ritual to, yes, it was that, but then it was not just that. It was even something that's even more scientifically based and well thought out.
And it carries on. It continues. It's like as you go through the book, it's evident that it's a beginning of something which is going to play out, obviously, and continue. And we're going to get into this, I think, after the break a little bit more about the what you call Black Christmas and the whole 2012, mega ritual in itself. And it's very interesting as we carry on in that. But let me ask you about a few more specifics here before we take a little break. Then Kent and Chris here. Let's, for example, talk about one interesting aspect: the rescue dog, Sirius. For those who haven't heard about that before, because this brings in the astrological component into it, the dog star, the 5-pointed star. What is all that about?
Well, again, that involves the dog star Sirius, and which was extremely significant to Aleister Crowley and is very important in occult thought, and variously seen as the silver star, and it is also known as the abode of Lucifer. So you have ties again to Luciferianism, worship of Lucifer, and without getting into a lot of the astrology behind 9/11, the date September 11th itself is keyed to Sirius and Sirius worship. I'll let the listening audience look to the book for a full explanation on that, because it gets a little bit difficult to describe, and you've got to follow a number of dates. But as it turns out, there are a series of dates that come into play with the 9/11 mega ritual in terms of the construction of various buildings that were destroyed that are tied to Sirius. So it is not just the date of 9/11 itself, which is which is connected to Sirius, but there's a whole sort of series of interconnections that reference the dog star as the central guiding spiritual force of humanity from a certain perspective, that is a basis for the 9/11 ritual. And so in context of that discussion and the idea of the Sirius, the dog star, as being central to 9/11, we find that the only police dog, search and rescue dog, killed on September 11th, 2001 was a yellow Labrador named Sirius. And of course, there were just any number of tributes to Sirius, the rescue dog, and there was a website set up that had all sorts of things on it. And this is one of the things that if you just talk about it by itself, people are not going to know what to make of it, and it sounds a little bit kooky. But what you understand in reading, and I talk about this a little later in the book, so people have the proper context to understand it. I introduce the importance of Sirius to the mega ritual and to the overall occult framework that was built for that day, and then I bring in this what is an obviously designed element to have Sirius, the name Sirius, spread throughout media reports of the 9/11 attacks, which is the death of this animal. And for those that killed 3,000 plus Americans on that day, they of course wouldn't think twice about smushing some poor dog in the basement of one of the Twin Towers, which is where the office was located, where the dog was housed. Mm-hmm. But that was the way that they were able to, the way that they chose to bring the name Sirius into play on that day in a way that would be just covered fairly extensively. But then unless you had some reason to suspect that this name was important to anyone involved with 9/11, it would just seem completely innocuous, and harmless. But it was ingenious, kind of an ingenious way that they devised to pay homage to Sirius. And that's what you find in quite a number of instances, that there's a lot of creativity that was involved, that went into the planning and execution of the event. And of course, there were practical objectives, from creating a domestic police state to taking the U.S. And its allies to war in Iraq and Afghanistan. But then there was this additional layer, the occult component and the psychological warfare that are of course very closely tied, that they put a tremendous amount of treasure into, and that's you can begin to get your head around, creating a false flag event to bolster the military-industrial complex and all of the the various related suppliers and companies, but the amount of energy, effort, and material that went into orchestrating and building this occult monstrosity just really sort of I was taken aback as I began to get a glimpse of it, and I think readers are probably going to have a bit of difficulty swallowing that and then digesting it, because it certainly makes a powerful statement that there are no lengths that these individuals and organizations won't go to accomplish their objectives and to subjugate the global public and to keep us in a state of perpetual fear. So that's the sort of the long and the short of the serious aspect of 9/11.
Sure. There's a lot more to this. Of course, we're going to get into this in some detail in the next segment. We're going to take a short break at this stage and talk more then later about the mind control aspect and also what Kent sees upcoming both for this year here and what's referred to as Black Christmas and everything else. We'll get there, but we'll take one step at a time here. So, by the way, before we take a break here, though, let's give out some websites. I want to, after this, talk with you as well, Chris, about Trine Day, and I want you to mention some of your titles and stuff. But Kent, where can people go right now to pick up a copy of the book? And as far as I understand, there is also a dedicated website to the book specifically, correct?
That's right. The website is themostdangerousbookintheworld.com. You can order the book at that location, or on Amazon or BarnesandNoble.com.
Really good. themostdangerousbookintheworld.com. We're going to have this link up, of course, and then directly to Trine Day. Plug your website a little bit, Chris. You have so many excellent titles on there, and I've gotten a great many books and great reading from you guys in the last few years. What are some of your favorite titles, Chris?
Well, I enjoy Peter Levinda's work, Sinister Forces, Daniel Estulon's True Story of the Bilderberg and Shadow Masters. We have Dr. Mary's Monkey by Ed Haslam, Me and Lee by Judith Baker, The Last Circle by Sherry Seymour, which goes into Danny Casolaro. Terrible Mistake by Hank Albarelli, which shows how Frank Olson died. I mean, and there's just so many. There's many more. And we've got Joan Mellon's new book coming out about CIA in Haiti. We've got St. John Hunt, E. Howard Hunt's book coming out. We've about his dad. We've got Don Adams, who's an FBI agent who was involved with the JFK investigation. We've got plenty.
You've got plenty. And that's right. TrineDay.com. That's the website. Go ahead, Chris.
You bet. And I appreciate all the support, and the books are available at at our website. They're available at Amazon, and they are available through Barnes and Noble in any bookstore. And we encourage people to go into Barnes and Noble and other stores and ask for our books, because when they hear them, even if they don't have them in stock, then they're more likely to bring them into stock. And do carry several of our titles. So, and like I said at the beginning, a book is an act of creation. And if it's a good creation, it even has a soul, and it has a life of its own. And we're humbled at the position that we're able to facilitate these books, and I thank people for their support over the years.
Absolutely, it's a great lineup. I urge everyone to go over to TrineDay.com and take a look at the lineup of books. There are much interesting reading for you if you're interested to know more about all of these different subjects that are suppressed and that are not covered at all in the mainstream, but incredibly detailed in some cases and documented. And so it's really good stuff. All right, guys, stay with us here. We're going to take a short break. We'll be right back with more All right. Welcome, gentlemen. This is going to be a great program. A lot of interesting things to discuss about. And let's do this one at a time here so we give our audience a chance to hear the difference between both of you, your voices, and so forth. So let's say hi and welcome to the author of this book that we're going to discuss today here. Kent Bain, welcome, and thank you for talking with us today, Kent.
Thank you. Good to be with you, Henrik.
Excellent. And we also have the publisher from Trine Day with us, Chris Milligan. Welcome, Chris. Many thanks for being with us here today as well.
My pleasure, sir. Thank you very much.
Absolutely. And you're the author of Fleshing Out the Skull and Bones, Investigations into America's Most Powerful Secret Society. Excellent book on the subject matter. And obviously in the last 2 years now, you've been busy with the publishing of many excellent books at Trine Day. So tell us just a little bit about your publishing history, Chris. I mean, you have some great titles out there. One of my favorites, Peter Levenda's Sinister Forces, but there's just so many more excellent books you have in the lineup, Chris.
Well, I'm totally amazed. I mean, basically, I'm a musician, and just happened that my father had worked for the intelligence services, and he had quit them in the late 50s, and he started talking to me in the late 60s, and I didn't understand him. But because of that, I hung out in a land that officially doesn't exist, CIA drugs. And I ran across a gentleman who was having trouble getting his book published. And so I became aware of, and then I was trying to write about Skull and Bones, and nobody would print my stuff. And so I became aware that there was a lot of titles out there, such as Peter Levenda's, which had been kicking around New York for years, and nobody would publish them. And I'm a simple guy. I read the Constitution, and it doesn't seem to me that books should not be published. And so I took it upon.
Why? What happened then? How you began to look at 9/11 with different eyes, basically as a mass ritual, as the subtitle to the book goes. Kent.
Right. I guess it was probably in around 2006 when I really began to become interested in the September 11th as more than just a terrorist attack. And as many of your listeners will understand or will know, there are multiple levels to 9/11, from the practical objectives that the orchestrators of the event had, to various other objectives. And as I kind of worked my way through the levels and began peeling the onion, I began to discover things that were just entirely new to me. So I had to do a lot of background research so that I was able to better understand what I was finding and encountering. And slowly I began to realize that there was a much bigger story there than had been told previously. And I had to do background and research in quite a number of fields in order to really understand what I was faced with and to understand what I was finding. And much of it, of course, was disturbing in nature and took a while for me to process and kind of to come to terms with. But it the shift in thinking required to understand 9/11 as more than a terrorist attack and even more than a false flag terrorism attack is pretty significant. And as I looked at the various elements and a lot of things that didn't make sense, and began to notice some common elements.
Myself to publish these suppressed works and bring them to the public, because books are a special thing. They're an act of creation, and they help us to understand ourselves and the world around us. So I'm happy to do it. It's a struggle, but I think good things are going to happen. So very kindly for your nice words, but that's why I do it.
Thank you. Excellent. We'll give you an opportunity, obviously, to mention some of your titles a little bit later and websites and everything else. But Kent, let's shift our focus to you a little bit. I've read that you have a very interesting and significant background to all of this, to the subject we'll be discussing today, both considering your interest, but also that you, or where you used to work and shall we say, we can call it proximity to some of the conspirators, some of the suspects here. Tell us about your background a little bit. What led you up to writing this book, coming out now about 11 years after the event?
Right. I was a bit of a latecomer to the 9/11, the search for 9/11 truth. Actually, when I worked at the Weekly Standard from 1995 to 2001, I really wasn't awake at that point. Really wasn't familiar with conspiracy theories, and so as I began to look into 9/11, there were a lot of things that caught my attention that I wanted to further investigate. It was certainly a process that I went through as far as becoming familiar with the existing conspiracy theories and then trying to make sense of them. So my understanding of 9/11 has evolved over a considerable period of time.
Indeed, and tell us a little bit where you worked and some of your close associates. Well, not associates then, but they worked in offices close to yours, correct?
That's right. I worked with William Crystal and Fred Barnes, Tucker Carlson, and David Brooks for about 5.5 years. And our offices, the magazine offices, were co-located basically with the Project for the New American Century, which was a neoconservative think tank that Bill Crystal had started that had a lot of signatories that had signed on to the organization and supported its position papers and that type of thing. It was interesting to be mixing with those individuals and to be in such close proximity to that organization. We were located in the same building with the American Enterprise Institute, and our office building was about 3 or 4 blocks from the White House, and ABC News was just directly around the corner. So it was an exciting experience for me. It was certainly a jump for me. I had previously been the art director for the Oxford American magazine, which at the time was based in Oxford, Mississippi, and published by author John Grisham. And so it was a bit of a culture shock when I landed the job and moved to Washington. But I just thoroughly enjoyed the time there, and it was a real learning opportunity for me. And I was exposed to a lot of different ideas and a lot of different schools of thought.
Yeah, definitely. I can imagine. Now, tell us a little bit about
common themes and some common ideas. I realized that there was a framework that could be used to understand all of these things that were confusing and really didn't seem to tie together. And that framework was psychological warfare. And in many instances, you will find occult aspects incorporated into psychological warfare. And as I became more and more familiar with the different topics and with the different aspects of 9/11, I realized that that's what I was looking at was a very large-scale application of occult-oriented psychological warfare programming.
There is a few different components here we need to get into and kind of lay the background, obviously, because we want to talk a little bit more about your findings and your conclusions, and you put it up in the book as a kind of the production overall and the producers, and we'll get into some of this. But I think one of the more important parts to go through here or look at in more detail before we kind of get into the meat of it, if you will, is to look at the symbolism, symbol literacy. I know you have a chapter on this, and this is highly important. Let's say we're talking to somebody who is a complete novice on these subject matters. Kent, how would you lay this up and to describe the symbolism behind the events?
Well, considering it at one point that I was very much a novice, I had to do a considerable amount of research to understand symbols and their meanings and their importance within occult doctrine, and then how they're utilized as parts of occult rituals, occult architecture, and just